Greetings and welcome back for another Music Theory Bite. In this video I'm going to be talking about modulation, or the change of tonal centers within a composition. If that sounds like something you'd like to learn more about, then this is the video for you. So as I just said, modulation is the change of tonal centers within a composition. If you think about it, almost all musical traditions throughout the world have this concept of a tonal center, a referential pitch around which all other pitches tend to want to resolve. Western art music is unique in that it's one of the few musical traditions in which we can change that tonal center within an individual composition through a process that we call modulation. Now, modulation is very important because it's the basis of an awful lot of the Western concept of musical form. That is, how musical forms, the roadmaps of how pieces of art music go together, are oftentimes based on the use of key areas. We start in one key, and then we explore a couple of other different keys before returning to that home key again for the end of the piece. It kind of creates just a built-in narrative of how we can start one place, move through lots of other places, and come home, which creates a very effective way of telling a musical story. So when we're talking about modulation, we have to talk about how it happens. There are three parts to a modulation. Those are the establishment of the first key, the actual modulation through a couple of different processes, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and then the establishment of the second key. So it's important that all three of these things happen in a convincing way. So for example, if I don't quite do the establishment of the first key in a convincing way, it's not going to sound like I ever modulated. So for example, in the example I'm about to play right here, I'm going to intend to go from the key of C major to the key of F major. But I'm going to not give you enough C major at the very beginning to establish that key convincingly. So here we go. Go from C major . So I started on a C chord, and I treated that as a dominant in the key of F major. I went straight to F major, but it never had the feeling of ever having started in the key of C major. It sounded like I started on a dominant in the key of F major, so therefore it doesn't really sound like I modulated. It sounded like I was in the key of F major the whole time. Likewise, if I start in the key of C major and this time modulate to G major, but I'm not going to establish that final tonic in some sort of convincing way, I'm just going to land on that final tonic and end there, it's going to, well, let's see what it sounds like. So starting in C major, so think to yourself, where are you hearing tonic right now? Are you hearing la, or are you hearing la? For most of you, what you're probably hearing is that second pitch, la, even though I'd intended to modulate to the key of G in this case. That is, I created some accidentals that pushed me towards the key of G. It never really had that final feeling of arriving on the dominant in the key of G because I didn't confirm the key in a satisfying way. What I did instead is what's called tonicization. Tonicization is the pointing towards a non-tonic scale degree in the key by using chromaticism in order to make it sound more important. Now, it's a fine line between tonicization and modulation. That is, a modulation can be thought of as a tonicization that I just take to a more significant extent. Or I could think of tonicization as a modulation that never quite gets to where we want it to go to. Either way, there's a psychological effect to it. There are probably a few of you out there watching this video right now who did think of that G as a new tonic, and that's fine. There's a little bit of subjectivity in how you hear a modulation. But most people probably heard that G major chord at the end of that as something that still wanted to resolve back to the home tonic. So now I'm going to try to create a real modulation here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to establish my first key. I'm going to do it in a convincing way, usually by creating a cadence in that key, or the expectation of a cadence. I will create a modulation, and then I'm going to arrive in my home key, or in my new key of the dominant, and I'm going to confirm that key with some sort of cadencing type of figure. So see if this is more convincing. Home key, and now it's time for me to modulate to my new key So I'm going to do it. Now sing where you're hearing tonic. Most likely it's la, and that is a modulation, that's a G, and I started out in C major. And there might be a few of you out there who are still hearing that C as the tonic pitch, in which case you heard that as a tonicization and not a modulation, but I would bet that most of you are hearing that G as the new tonic, and then I could proceed on from there and continue on the piece. So the three parts of a modulation are the establishment of the first key, and by establishment I mean that I do something convincing to make your ear think that we are in that home key. And then the actual process of modulation, which I'll talk about here in just a second. And then the arrival on the second key and its confirmation, the establishment of that second key, again, usually through some sort of cadence or expectation of a cadence that I give you. So creating a modulation oftentimes is taking a tonicization and expanding its scope in order to confirm that we are indeed in a new key and have a new tonal center. So when we're talking about the actual techniques of modulation, I like to divide them into two categories: unprepared modulations and common element modulations. We'll deal with the unprepared modulations first, even though they are a little bit less common than the common element modulations. An unprepared modulation is a modulation that simply is not hinted at ahead of time. We're just going along in one key. So for example, I'm starting in the key of D major. And then instead of going to the tonic that you expect, I might just shift up a half step to the key of E flat major. No preparation, we just suddenly land in the key of E flat major. Now, that shows up fairly commonly in jazz music, rock and roll music, popular music, because it's an easy way to increase the energy level of a piece of music. It increases the excitement, and it's fairly easy to accomplish. You're just going along in one key, and then you just go into the new key without any preparation. It doesn't take a whole lot of technical expertise to make that work. If I separate the two keys by the end of a phrase, a special type of direct modulation, we'll call this a phrase modulation. So I would cadence in my original key, and then when the next phrase begins, I'll just start off in a new key. In that case, I modulated a third away from D major to B flat major. At the end of the phrase, after I stopped on a cadence in D major, then I just simply reset and started a new phrase in the key of B flat major. Now, if we have material that's identical but just presented in different keys, so a phrase modulation which the two elements are completely the same, kind of like what I just played there, some theorists will call that a sequential modulation. That is, we'll go along and play the element in one key, and then we will just repeat the entire thing in a new key. So that would be a type of direct modulation that we call a sequential modulation. And those are our unprepared types of modulatory techniques. The other types of modulation that are more common in Western art music are what I call common element modulations. And they all work basically the same way. That is, there has to be a common element between the original key and the new key that can be exploited in order to use this technique. So, for example, if I use what's called a common tone modulation, I need to have a tone, a pitch that is in common between the first key and the second key. So what I will do is I will play along in the first key, starting in the key of C major in this case. And then when I reach this pitch, which is scale degree 2, or scale degree 3, which is an E in this case, then I can simply treat that as another scale degree in another key, as long as that key has the pitch E in it. So in this case, why don't I go to E major? So the fact that the pitch E exists as scale degree 3 in the original key, C major, and as scale degree 1 in the rival key, E major, allows me to use that as a common element. Now, because I was only using a melody in this case, some people would call this monophonic modulation, where what we're doing is we're simply changing the arrangement of half steps within the pitch collection to point towards a new tonic. And if you think about it, that's really what modulation is. We take the pitches, we take the half steps which tell us where the tonal center is, and we shift them to new places, and that will point us towards a new tonal center. More common in the common element modulations is what we call a common chord modulation. A common chord modulation works very much the same way. That is, we have a chord that is identical between two different keys. So for example, I could be looking at a D minor chord which exists in the key of C major. It is the 2 chord, the supertonic chord in that key. I can modulate using that chord as what's called a pivot to any other key that contains a D minor chord in it. So it's a 2 chord in the key of C major, and it could be a 6 chord in the key of F major. So I can get from C major to F major by, first of all, getting to a D minor chord. So I'm here in the key of C, I'll go from a 1 to a 4 to a 2 chord. Now I simply recharacterize that chord as a 6 chord in my new key. I'm in the key of F major now. This is a 6 chord, so it's my 6 chord. I'm going to go to a 2 chord, to a 5 chord, to a 1 chord in the key of F. Notice how you don't actually hear the modulation occurring until after it has occurred. That is, we hear the chromaticism that points us towards the new key after the modulation has already happened. And that's a very important point, because when we hear these things, the modulation has already occurred, and when we're doing analysis, we look for that point, that we find the accidentals that point us towards the new key, and then we generally back up 1 chord, and we can see if that is a pivot. So it requires a chord that is identical in quality and sound between the 2 keys, and we simply relabel that chord from one thing to another. That's what we call diatonic common chord modulation. And so it helps to know, if you're modulating from one key to another, what are the common chords between those 2 keys. So for example, with my example of a D minor chord, I could start in the key of C major, and I could go to D minor, because that has a D minor chord in it. I could go to F major, because that has a D minor chord as the 6th chord in it. If I treated the D minor chord as a 4 chord, I could go to A minor. So there's lots of places I can go, as long as I'm aware of where a D minor chord shows up in other keys. Now, if the chord is chromatic in one of those 2 keys, we could call that a chromatic common chord modulation. So for example, starting in the key of C, again, I'm going to go to a 4 chord, then I'm going to go to a 5, 7, a 5, a D major chord. Chromatic in the original key, but diatonic in my new key of G major. And then of course I want to confirm that key. And there we go. So it's chromatic in the original key, diatonic in the 2nd key, and helps me to modulate from, in this case, the key of C major to G major. It could be chromatic in either the starting key or the landing key, the arrival key. As long as it's chromatic in one of those 2 keys, then we can call it a chromatic common chord modulation. Now, if I have a chromatic common chord modulation in which I have to enharmonically respell one or more of the pitches, then I have what's called an enharmonic modulation. A very common example of that is, if I'm in the key of C minor, and I get to, let's say I go to an augmented 6th chord. We'll make it a German augmented 6th. If you don't know what that is, I'll have a video on that one up very soon. It sounds like this. And typically this German augmented 6th chord will go out to a 1, 6, 4, to a 5, 7, like that. Now notice how this augmented 6th chord has the same sound as a dominant 7th chord. In the key of C minor, it's spelled A flat, C, E flat, F sharp, but it sounds like a dominant 7th chord. So if I were to take this and take that F sharp and respell it as a G flat, it now becomes a dominant 7th, which I can use to modulate to the key of D flat, in this case D flat major. So it works like this. Go from my tonic to a German augmented 6th, and then use this as a pivot, an enharmonic pivot, to get me to the key of D flat major. So as long as the chord has an enharmonic respelling from the original key to the second key, we call that an enharmonic modulation. So let's review. Modulation is the changing of tonal centers within a composition. There are 3 parts to a modulation. First, we have the establishment of the first key. Then we have the actual modulation, which can be either direct or a common element modulation. And then we have the establishment of the arrival key. Direct modulations or unprepared modulations are modulations that just happen without any sort of preparation, any sort of expectation created on the part of the listener. We just move from one key to the next. If it happens at the beginning of a phrase, we call that a phrase modulation. And if it happens by repeating the material simply in a different key, we would call that a sequential modulation. Common element modulations work by having an element, either a pitch or a chord, that is in both the home key and the arrival key. And what we simply do is we get to that chord in some sort of legal way, and then we recharacterize the elements of that chord into the new key, and then we use that then to point us towards our arrival in the new key. If the chord is diatonic, or the element is diatonic in both the home key and the arrival key, we call it a diatonic common chord modulation. If it's chromatic in one of the 2 keys, we call that a chromatic common chord modulation. And if we have to respell something enharmonically from one key to the next, we call that an enharmonic common chord modulation. And I'll go into more detail on how those work in later videos. For now, it's enough to just sort of understand the basic principles of how modulation works and the basic techniques we use to get from one key to another. Well, that does it for this video. If you found it helpful, please make sure you like it. Feel free to leave constructive comments below, and as always, make sure you subscribe to my channel for the latest music theory bites as they become available. Until next time.